Hello, and welcome back to Codex. Today's speaker is Ole Christensen from the Technical University of Denmark. Professor Christensen is an expert in frame theory. Today, he'll be talking about information packets, redundancy, and weaving frames. Take it away, Ole.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. You already heard the name of the talk, and you can also see it here. The key thing will actually be the information packets. Weaving frames come up as a topic that will, at the end, motivate our information packages, but information packets is really what it is about. And for that reason, I'll simply start by giving the definition of information packet before I even introduce what I want to speak about today. Information packages is a concept that I introduced with my two Korean co-authors, Kim and Kim, about a year ago. At the end of the talk, I will explain why it came up. What I want to do at the beginning of the talk is to motivate it from the point of view of classical frame theory. So the definition is, as you can see here, we start by looking at any separable Hilbert space H, and then we look at a collection of closed subspaces WK. And we say that such a collection of spaces is an information packet if each element F in the Hilbert space has a representation as an unconditional convergent expansion of elements in the space Wj. That means for each given element F, we should be able to pick elements Fj in the spaces Fj, such that F is then equal to the unconditional convergent infinite series of these elements Fj. What I would like to do at the beginning of the talk is to motivate that this is actually a natural concept in frame theory. If you look at the definition as it is stated here, you can clearly see that it is related to frame theory, because in frame theory you have the compositions of the type we are writing here. It's just that the sum we are looking at is what we would call sum of projection onto one-dimensional subspaces. So what is going on here is that we are replacing these one-dimensional spaces by vector spaces Wj of any dimension. What I'll do is actually to relate this concept of information packages with a lot of other topics in frame theory. And for that reason, I'll start with talk with what I call frames variation on a theme. That means for the first time for I don't know how many years, I'll actually state the frame definition for you. Again, usually I don't do it in my talks because I think that this is something all of us know, but because I want to discuss different types of frame expansions, I would like to also mention the frame definition this time. You can see that I mark this part with blue, and you can also see that at the end of the list of what I'll do, I come back to the information packages. So the idea is that I begin by introducing information packages from the point of view of classical frame theory. Then I do something that looks completely different. I'll speak about, you can see all the topics that I just marked with black. I'll speak about Carlson frames, weaving frames, and an open problem. But the reason that these topics come in is because they are the paths that made me introduce the information packages at the very beginning. So I will tell you what I know about the Carlson frame. I'll speak about its redundancy property. I'll show how this is related to the topic from Pete Casassa about weaving frames, and I will show how this finally led us to formulate an open problem about wavelet frames. And after doing that, I will hopefully be able to make it clear to you that this is leading to the information packages in a natural way. And that was the way we found the information packages, actually. Let's just go ahead and speak about frame theory. So as I said, for the first time for several years, I will actually write down the definition of frame. All of you know it, so I'll not go into details with it. I'll just say this is the definition that we have. And all of you also know that if you have a frame, we have a frame decomposition. We have the possibility of expanding every element in the Hilbert space as an infinitely sum of an infinitely linear combination of the elements Fk with some coefficients, which are also given in terms of a frame, namely the so-called dual frame. So we know that very well, all of us. The frame theory has been, what I would say, very successful for the last 30 years. And of course, this implies that a lot of related topics have been defined in the literature. And I would like to go through some of them. And I'll do it very superficially, but then at the end, there are 3 of them that I'll select, and then I'll go more in details with those. But what we can do is to modify the frame condition. And I think the first one that appeared in the literature was to say, let's look at the frame conditions, but let's assume that it only holds for a subspace. So if your elements Fk, if they are not forming a total family in Fk, you might not have the frame condition satisfied on all of 8, but you might have it on the closed linear span of the elements Fk. And this is what led to the concept of a frame sequence. And you can hear from the way I'm phrasing it, frame sequence theory runs exactly the same way as standard frame theory, because you just let the Hilbert space you're working with, you just let it be the closed linear span of the elements Fk. So there's absolutely no change in that. There's also the idea of saying maybe we only have one of the 2 frame conditions satisfied, either the lower one or the upper one. And I actually considered that question already in my PhD thesis. So already in 1993, I published my first article about that. What I was doing at that time was to assume that we have the lower frame condition satisfied, but not the upper one. And in that case, it actually turns out that you can run frame theory in a slightly modified way. So what happens is that if you have the lower frame bound, then the synthesis operator in frame theory will no longer be a bounded operator. It will be an unbounded operator. But you can put conditions on the operator in terms of, for example, being a closed operator. If you do that, you are able to run some kind of theory that is similar to our frame theory. It's more complicated, of course, to work with in practice because you deal with unbounded operators, but on the theoretical level, you end up with something that is similar. The topic has also been taken up in more recent years by Peter Ballas and his groups, and Peter Ballas is the one who called it a lower semi-frame. You can also consider the case where you have the upper frame condition satisfied, but not the lower one. From the point of view of frame theory, this is not very interesting because if you just have the upper bound satisfied, but not the lower one, you might not have a complete family of elements in your vector space. That means you might not get any expansions of the elements in your space. And it's clear an example of just having the upper bound satisfied would be that all the elements Fk are just a zero vector. So it's clear you don't get anything out of the upper bound by itself. There's also the topic of shorter frames, but this is one of the topics that I will actually speak about in more detail. So I'll just say that this is a variation of frame theory. I'll not go into it at the moment. And there's the idea of looking at continuous frames. And in that case, we replace the discrete index sets. We have these elements, Fk in the frame condition, where k is running from 1 to infinity. So we replace these Fks with k in a discrete set by Fks where k is running for example, in an interval or running through all of R. And if you do that, then the summation will be exchanged by an integral. And again, you can actually run a theory that in many aspects is very, very similar to standard frame theory. Another thing you can do is to move from Hilbert spaces to Banach spaces. Already before frames were considered in details in the literature, there was the topic of atomic decomposition around. And an atomic decomposition in the Banach space consists of a family of elements in the space having the property that you can expand arbitrary elements in the space in terms of infinite linear combinations of these elements. So as I say, the topic was around even before frame theory was introduced. Then in the 90s, Grothendieck was introducing Banach frames. In Banach frames theory, you have somewhat more control because the coefficients that appear in the atomic decomposition are supposed to satisfy certain norm estimates, exactly like we have in the frame condition that we have the L2 norm of the inner product between F and Fk, that this is the sum of these coefficients is bounded below and above. You have similar things for the Banach frames, just with different sequence spaces than little L2. And also you have the possibility of recovering your element to have a reproducing formula that is generating all elements in the space, but not necessarily in terms of an infinite series, but in terms of an operator acting on these frame coefficients. So the theory in Banach spaces is significantly more complicated than Hilbert spaces. But I'll not speak about it in the lecture. I just want to mention that this is also one of the variations on the theme. What I'll do in more details is the next step, because as I already told you, when we are looking at the frame decomposition, then we are decomposing every element in the space in terms of one-dimensional projections, namely projections onto each of the elements Fk. And there's also been the idea around of decomposing F in terms of projecting onto higher dimensional spaces. And this is what leads to the topic of fusion frames. And you could see that the definition I gave of information packages is along this line, because we were in information packages decomposing elements in the space in terms of elements belonging to some vector spaces Wj. But also fusion frames and information packages are on the list of what I want to do in detail, so I don't say much more here. I just want to mention the last step of generalization that comes in here. If you speak about fusion frames, you are representing elements in the space in terms of infinite sums of projections onto vector spaces. And that means you can hear already from the formulation that you are getting some operators into the game. And what is going on with the so-called D-frames is that you're making decompositions in terms of a collection of operators. So again, this is a topic I'll not go into detail with. But again, it's also a theory that runs very parallel to standard frame theory. What I'll discuss in a little bit more detail, you'll see it on the next slides. I single out the 3 topics that I would like to compare with frame theory. You see them marked here with blue. So I'll speak a little bit more about Schauder frames. I'll speak a little bit more about fusion frames and information packages. And what I want to explain to you is that the step going from standard frames to Schauder frames is conceptually exactly the same as the step going from fusion frames to information packages. So I hope that this is what I'll be able to convey to you. So in order to do that, let us again just look at what comes out from the frame decomposition. We start with any frame of elements Fk. The frame decomposition tells us that then there exists at least one dual frame Dk, such that we have the reconstruction formula for each element F in the Hilbert space. What Schauder frames is doing for us is to shortcut the frame condition and go straight to the conclusion. And what I mean by this is that the definition of a Schauder frame is that it is just a collection of elements in the Hilbert space having the property that there exists a sequence Dk. We don't put any conditions of either Fk or Dk, but it's just that these sequences exist and they have the property that each element F in the space has an unconditional convergent expansion. And then if you look at the expansion I'm writing down, it looks precisely like the decomposition we got out from the frames. So you can see it's really what I say. We are shortcutting the frame condition. We are going straight to the conclusion. And the definition is opening up the possibility for us to look at cases where we have this expansion, but where it is not necessarily coming from frame theory. And there are many examples of cases where you get it. For example, if you look at the elements Fk that basically are elements in an orthonorm basis, but they are scaled in the wrong way. So if you scale elements in the wrong way, you might not get either the lower frame condition or the upper frame condition to be satisfied, but you can still find a dual, because the dual could just be, again, the orthonorm basis, but scaled the opposite way. So if the elements are scaled up, they are multiplied with some large numbers, you can just divide the elements in the orthonormal basis by the same number, and then you get this decomposition. And I actually never went into this theory because I was thinking that we are lacking natural examples for this, because this scaling up and scaling down of elements in an orthonormal basis, I didn't consider it interesting enough. But there are other motivations for looking at Schauder frames. And if you look at Garber frames at critical or Garber systems at critical density, there are cases where you don't get frame decompositions, but you might get decompositions of frame, and they look like frame decompositions, but they are not based on frames. So there are motivations in the literature for considering the Schauder frames. But as I admit openly to you, I'm not really an expert in it, because I have not been considering them very much. Why are they called Schauder frames? This is because they generalize what we call Schauder bases. Because Schauder bases are giving us exactly a decomposition of the type I'm stating here. The difference between a Schauder basis and a Schauder frame is that for Schauder bases, you can hear it in the word we are speaking about, bases, and this means that the coefficients are unique. And also that condition is not appearing here for Shouter frames. Shouter frames is really just a collection of vectors such that we get the reconstruction formula as it's stated here. There's no other condition on the elements. Let's take the step to the fusion frames. And again, fusion frames is a classical concept. I would say now it's at least 20 years old. The fusion frame consists of a collection of closed subspaces of our Hilbert space. We again call them Wj, and we consider the operator Pj, which is the orthogonal projection of H onto the corresponding space Wj. Then we consider a collection of scalars omega j, and we say that the pairing of these spaces Wj and omega j form a fusion frame if the displayed condition is satisfied. You can see it's again something about existence of two constants a and b, such that, yeah, look at it, it's very similar to the frame condition. I guess most of you are already familiar with that topic. If you take these projection operators to be projections onto one-dimensional vectors, then the condition you're looking at here boil down exactly to the frame condition. And that's the reason that these weights are occurring here. Nice thing about fusion frame, you can say it depends on the way you look at it, whether you call it the nice thing or the bad thing. The nice thing, I would say, is that the fusion frame theory runs very parallel to frame theory. So a lot of the basic statements about frame theory can actually be generalized without any complications to fusion frames. You just run exactly the same proof. And you can see already from this single result I want to mention that we also have a fusion frame decomposition. And this is exactly for frame theory based on having a good definition of a frame operator. If you look at the case of these PJs being projection down on one-dimensional spaces, it is exactly the frame operator we are dealing with. And this means that the proof is running exactly the same way and you're getting a fusion frame decomposition. And it is actually sort of an industry to prove results for fusion frames and simply do it by copying a lot of things you have for frames. The reason that I want to state it here, and again, I have not really been considering fusion frames in any of my papers. It's like Shouter frames. It's a topic I've been putting a little bit aside. But the reason that I want to mention it here is that it has a clear connection to the information packages. Because you can see from the fusion frame decomposition that it is again that we are decomposing F in terms of projections down to a collection of spaces Wj. It's not exactly the same because you can see that in the decomposition we are speaking about PJF, so we are projecting down to the space, but there's also the inverse frame operator acting on it. So we are somehow taking these projections down to the spaces Wj, and then we are moving them to another space by the inverse frame operator. But at least conceptually, we are projecting down on the spaces, and at least in the case where the frame operator is the identity, or a multiple of the identity, then it is directly a projection down on the spaces Wj. But what you can see now is, if I again state the definition of information packages, you can see that what we are doing here, going from a fusion frame to an information package, this is exactly the same as what we did going from a frame to a Shouter frame, because we are shortcutting the condition. So we have the condition in fusion frames. We have these two inequalities that need to be satisfied. Why do we put these two inequalities? This is because then we end up with a fusion frame decomposition. But what we are doing with the information packages is to shortcut this definition and go straight to the conclusion and say, we are just looking at a collection of spaces having the property that each F in the space can be represented as an infinite sum of elements from the corresponding spaces Wj. So this is what I say, to go from classical frames to Shouter frames. That meant to shortcut the frame condition and go straight to the conclusion. This is precisely what we are doing here when we are going from fusion frames to the information packages. But this is just the way I'm phrasing it now, because that was not the way we got the idea of looking at the topic. And this is what I want to explain to you in the talk. But before I do that, let us relate the topics of fusion frames and information packages. So information packages, they are actually generalizing the fusion frame. And the way you can see that is that if you have a fusion frame, you have the fusion frame decomposition. And if you look at the fusion frame decomposition, then there is actually already an information package in it. I can see that there's a question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is, in the definition of information package, do you require that each fj depends continuously on f? Because this is the case for a Schauder frame. So
We are not saying that. We are not asking that question.
you are
So this is
that each fj depends continuously on f. It may be a non-continuous function of f, right?
yes,
Because for
definitely.
Schauder frame, the requirement is that the coefficients depend continuously on the function that you are expanding.
There are several definitions of the Schauder frames in the literature. Some of them require what you say, and some of them really just ask for the decomposition. Some of them ask for unconditional convergence. So it really depends on the author how they define the Schauder frames.
Okay, thank you very much.
And at least here, we don't put any conditions. So what I say is, if you have a fusion frame, we also have an information package. And the way you can see that is to look at the fusion frame decomposition. And this is clearly related to the decomposition we have in terms of an information package, but not based on the spaces Wj, because the operators Pj, they are the projections onto Wj, but then we have s to the minus 1 in front of this projection operator. So that means the fusion frame decomposition is showing that s to the minus 1 acting on the spaces Wj is an information package. But then you can do exactly like you can also do in frame theory. You can show that if you have an information package and you act on it with a bounded bijective and a bounded and surjective operator is actually enough, then you again get an information package. So you just take this information package s to the minus 1 Wj and you act with the operator s. Then you get that Wj is an information package by itself. So information packages, they are more general, at least, than fusion frames. The fact that they are actually more general is due to the fact that we can also give examples of an information package that is not related to a fusion frames. And this is what I do next. So let's consider any orthonormal basis Ek in our Hilbert space. And then we consider the two-dimensional spaces Wj formed by taking the span of the jth vector, but we add the vector E1 to the space. This is clearly an information package because we have the orthonormal basis decomposition of each element in the space. You can see I typed it in line 5, I think, f equal to the sum of inner products f ek. And these elements ek, they are part of the space wk. So that means the orthonormal basis decomposition is clearly a decomposition of f into an infinite sum of elements fk, where the element fk belongs to the space wk. So that means we clearly have an information package here, but we don't have a fusion frame. And in order to see that, I just wrote down the definition of the fusion frame again. This is what you see in the last displayed line on the page. What we'll do is to look at that condition and then we put in particular elements in the Hilbert space. So I take the element f we are looking at and I simply let it be the kth element in the orthonormal basis we are dealing with. And if you do that for the first element E1, then you can see that we are getting the projection operator Pj acting on E1. We have to calculate the norm of that one. But since the space, each of the spaces Wj, they actually contain the vector E1, then all of these projections simply give us E1, so the norm is equal to 1, meaning that the condition we are looking at, the element, the infinite sum in the fusion frame condition is simply the sum from j equal to 1 to infinity of omega j to the power 2. So this is what happens if we put in the element E1 on the place of f. And if we put in any other elements, ek, then only one of them will give a contribution, namely when we act with the kth projection operator. And in that case, we get a factor of 1. So that means the sum we are looking at becomes omega k to the power 2. And this means that the fusion frame property means that the infinite sum of omega j to the power 2 must be between a and b, and also each of the omega j to the power 2 must be between a and b. And this is clearly impossible. So that means here we have a good example of an information package, but it has no relationship to a fusion frame. No matter how you choose these weights in the fusion frame decomposition, you do not have a fusion frame here. What I'll do now is to leave the fusion frames, leave the information packages for a little bit, and then I will walk you through the story of how we introduced the information packages, and then you'll see an application of them at that time. So why did we get the idea of looking at them? So it sounds like I'm now doing something completely different, because I will speak about the so-called Carlson frame. The Carlson frame was introduced by Akram Al-Droubi and Carlos Gabrieli, Ursula Molter, and Sui Tang in 2014. And it's a really beautiful example of a frame that has a very particular structure. It is defined by what we call an orbit of a bounded linear operator. So what that means is what you can see in the last line. So at the moment, just skip all the technical conditions and go to the last line of the slide. You can see that what we are dealing with is a frame that have the form t to the power k acting on phi. So what this means is that t is a bounded linear operator on our Hilbert space, and since we have t to the power k and the sum is from k equal to 0 to infinity, it means that we are iterating that operator and we are acting on a particular well-chosen element in the space. And what is going on in this particular construction is that we consider a diagonal operator. This is what you can see in line 4. We are looking at a certain orthonormal basis for our space, and the operator has the form t acting on the kth element in the orthonormal basis is equal to some constant lambda k times ek. So it's clearly a diagonal operator with respect to that given orthonormal basis. And what we assume is that the lambda k satisfy the so-called Carlson condition. This is something you don't need to worry about. It's a classical condition from harmonic analysis, but don't worry about it. Just look at this concrete case I'm writing, lambda k equal to 1 minus alpha to the minus k, where alpha is bigger than 1. That would be a case that satisfies the condition. And this is fully enough for what we'll do in the lecture to look at that particular case. So we are looking at this diagonal operator, we are looking at these lambda k's, and then we are defining a particular element phi, and also don't worry about the way it's defined. What is coming out of it is that in this setup, we actually get this frame t to the power k acting on phi. It's a wonderful construction, and even more wonderful is that it has a lot of nice properties. And I would like to mention some of these properties. So I looked at it with my collaborators, Marci Hassanesab and Philip Fritz and Diana Stoeva. And what we proved is that if we add just a single extra condition to what we had on this slide, namely the one you can see marked with red, saying that lambda k in absolute value should be a strictly increasing sequence. If this is the case, then for any choice of n, where n is just a positive integer, t to the power capital Nk of phi is also a frame. So before I discuss what it means, let me just emphasize that you don't need to worry about the conditions here, because we have the Carlson frame, and I stated this canonical case of the Carlson frame where you took lambda k equal to 1 minus alpha to the minus k. And this is clearly a strictly increasing positive sequence. So that means we have a case where all the conditions are satisfied. So just think about that case for the rest of the talk. So what is the condition? What is the result saying here? That t to the power capital Nk acting on phi is a frame. What it means is that we are actually selecting 1 out of k of each of the frame elements. Because instead of taking the powers t to the power k, we look at the power t to the power capital Nk. So if you do that for k equal to 4, then you can see that the Carlson frame is, if you write it down in standard notation, you just call the frame element F0, F1, F2, F3, and so on. Then you can see what we are doing for capital N equal to 4 is that we are selecting each fourth element. We are selecting F0, we are selecting F4, we are selecting F8, and so on. That means what the theorem here is doing for us, it is to say we are looking at a particular frame having the property that if we pick each nth element, then that will form a frame by itself. And this is actually a very particular property for a frame. And in order to explain that, I will come back to the Carlson frame, but I would like to show to you that it's a very particular property by looking at some other types of frames and show that they certainly don't have this property. So if you, for example, look at Garber frames, what is a Garber frame? This is a collection of elements in L2 that you get by fixing a function in L2 and then act with a collection of translation operators and modulation operators. So you can see in my notation, I call an EMB-TNA acting on G. Usually, in most of the literature, people are actually not using the letter E for the modulation operator. They're using M instead. What we know about Garber frames is that if a system of this type, if a Garber system should have any chance to be a frame, it is necessary that the elements are satisfying a density condition, and the density condition means that the product AB of the translation parameter and the modulation parameter must be smaller than or equal to 1. Now, if you want to take 1 out of n element of a Garber frame, what would be the natural way to do that? I would say that the natural thing would be to replace either the translation parameter A or the modulation parameter B by n times the parameter. That means the natural thing to look at would be to look at these two systems that are right in the two displayed equations, to look either at EMB Tn capital A, capital N times A acting on G, or the system E with index M capital N B composed with a translation operator T and A. That would correspond to exactly what we have done for the Carlson frame, namely to pick 1 out of n elements. The issue is that such systems can never be frames for big values of n because they by themselves correspond to new Garber systems. But suddenly the product of the parameters is not AB anymore, it's capital N times AB. And that means if you do this for large value of n, then you definitely get a value NAB that is larger than 1, and that means they have no chance for being a frame anymore. So that means this subsampling property we are getting for the Carlson system, namely that we can take 1 out of n elements and it's still a frame, there is no way that we can get that for Garber frames. Of course, there's also an open problem stated here, namely what I say here, the irregular case is completely open because what I do here is to take 1 out of n in a very particular way. I'm not excluding that you could order your elements in a Garber frame in a crazy way such that you could have the property of taking 1 out of n. I just don't know how to do it, and I'm sure that it would be technically very complicated. But it's just, if you do it the natural way, as I'm stating here, then there's no way that you can keep the frame property by taking 1 out of n. And if you try to look at wavelet system, you bump into similar problems. And I would also like to mention that because the wavelet frames actually turns into something that I'll discuss at the end of the talk. And then at that moment, they are actually the one that give us the information packages. So I just want to mention that if you do it in a slightly, what I would call naive way, you bump into the same problem. So what is the wavelet system? It's a collection of functions we obtain by, again, shifting a single function psi, but then we are acting on it also with scaling operators. That is what you see here. The system has the form a to the power j half psi of a to the power j x minus kb. So it's clearly a composition of scaling operators and translation operators. And if you write that down in standard notation, like the one Debussy was using, for example, then you get the system you see displayed here on the final line, d with index a to the power j, and then the translation operator with index kb, all of it acting on the function psi. It's a classical result, going back to Chui and Xi, that if you want to have a frame of this type, then the function psi and the parameters a and b have to satisfy a certain condition, namely the one that is stated here. If you look at the sum of the absolute value to the power 2 of the Fourier transform of your psi acting on a to the power j psi, that function has to be bounded below and above. And that result is very fast, giving us again a negative result for wavelet frames. So what it says is that if you're looking at a band-limited wavelet, that means psi hat is compactly supported, and then we assume that the support of psi is bounded away from 0. Then we cannot have the frame property for the system where we take 1 out of n elements when n is a large number. So that means the breakdown we had for Garber systems will also occur for wavelet systems under these assumptions that we are looking at bandlimit wavelet systems which have support that is bounded away from zero. And I'll not really walk you through the proof, but it's simply a question of looking at the support of psi hat and then identifying an interval of the gammas such that the sum that occur in Chui and Xi's result simply is identically equal to zero, and that means this necessary condition is breaking down. So I will not do it, but it's really a question of a few lines of calculations. But we will come back to this result later, and it turns out that if you do a small modification of what I'm doing here, we actually get a positive result. But at the moment, if you look at the function such that the support of psi hat is bounded away from zero, then we clearly have a no-go result exactly like we had for the Garber system. So this is just showing you that this subsampling property of the Carlson frame, this is clearly not something you are getting for free. It is a very particular property for the Carlson frame. And I'll state a couple of more properties of the Carlson frame. What we do here is, again, to look at the Carlson frames exactly like it was defined. We have still the condition before that the absolute value of lambda k is an increasing sequence. But you can see that I add one more condition with rate, namely that lambda 1 is non-zero. This is also a condition that is satisfied for standard examples, so this is not something that is bothering us. And then the conclusion suddenly involves two parameters, capital N and K. Again, parameters that can be arbitrary. You can see that the N has exactly the same role as before, but the K has the role that instead of starting with small k equal to 0, we start with k equal to capital K. So what it says is that the frame we are dealing with has the property we spoke about before, that you can take one out of n element and you still have the property, the frame property. But on top of that, you can do one more thing, namely you can delete as many elements as you want. You can delete the first k elements for an arbitrary value of k. This is a very particular property for a frame. What I'll do in the next slides is to go back to the case where capital is equal to 0, but I'll do some other small modifications. And this is what you see here. Again, the rate text is the same assumptions as we had before, and we are not changing them in the rest of the lecture, so they stay the same. But the conclusion sounds a little bit different. We still have this capital N, which is an arbitrary positive integer, but now we also look at a j that is just a fixed integer between 0 and n minus 1. So what the conclusion says is that the family of t to the power j plus capital Nk acting on phi is a frame. So the new thing is really just the j that comes in here, and you can see that if you put j equal to 0, you end up with exactly the conclusion we had before. So for j equal to 0, there's nothing new going on here. But what is the role of this j? Let us again illustrate this by looking at the case capital N equal to 4. For j equal to 0, you get precisely the same elements as before. You get F0, you get F4, you get F8, and so on. You get that this family is a frame. And this is a conclusion I gave to you already a number of slides before. What happened then with j equal to 1? That means the indexes are getting shift. That means that also F1, F5, F9, and so on form a frame. And if you do it with j equal to 2, you get F2, F6, F10, and so on form a frame. And for j equal to 3, F3, F7, F11, and so on form a frame. So what the result is saying that the Carlson frame we are dealing with can actually be decomposed into 4 subsequences, and each of them form a frame by themselves. And if you want to be more general and you just take an arbitrary value for capital N, it says that the frame we are looking at can be decomposed into capital N subsequences, each of them being a frame. But you see that we are selecting these subsequences in a very regular way, because the first one is F0, F4, F8, the next one is F1, F5, F9, and so on. So there's a regular spacing between the elements in the frame. And the question we were asking ourselves at that time is, what happens if we don't have this regular spacing between the elements? And we were not able to get through with what we wanted to do, so we formulated a conjecture. And the way the result or the conjecture is phrased is very similar to what you've seen before. It's again that we fix an arbitrary value for capital N, but now we consider not a j, but we consider a j that depends on what k we are looking at. So jk is something between 0 and n minus 1, and then the conjecture says that t to the power jk plus capital NK acting on phi is a frame. So what this conjecture actually says, if it is true, if you again look at the case where capital N is equal to 4, then you can see in the last line, I write down the elements in the frame, F0, F1, F2, and so on, but I mark the first elements with black, the next 4 with red, the next 4 with blue, and so on. And what the result says is that if you just pick one element in each of the color groups, you should have a frame. This is what the conjecture says. And the conjecture says that this holds not only for capital N equal to 4, but it would hold for all values of capital N. And the reason that we wanted to prove this result is that we were thinking that such a frame is optimal in terms of erasures. If you want to transmit information, what it actually says is that if just one out of the first n coefficients arrives safely and one out of the next n elements arrives safely and so on, then you are able to recover your full information. That is the intuition behind this result. But we were not able to prove the result. Fortunately, there were some people out there who were more clever than us, namely Ilya Kristel and Brendan Miller. They were able to confirm the conjecture. And you can see I basically just state the result here. It says that if we look at the Carlson frame and we pick a subsequence that just contains at least one out of n consecutive elements, then it will be a frame by itself. So by now, it's not a conjecture anymore. It's actually a theorem. So what I want to do in the last part of the topic is to relate that to weaving frames, and then I come back to the information packages. The first step will be to say, what did we prove before we needed the help from Ilya Kristel and Brendan Miller? We proved that for each capital N, we can split our frame into capital N subframes. So there's nothing new here. The first one is what you see in the first row, F0, F capital N, F2 capital N, and so on. The next one is F1, F1 plus capital N, and so on. So each of these rows of elements you're looking at here, they form frames. What the result by Ilya and Brendan shows is that if you don't go row-wise, but you go column-wise, that means in the first column, that means the elements F0, F1, F2 down to Fn-1, you pick one of these elements. And then you go to the next, this is F capital N, the next one is F1 plus capital N, and so on. From that column, you also pick one element, and you continue like this throughout your capital N frames. Then that subsequence you select that way is again a frame. This is precisely what you see in the displayed line in line 3. This is exactly what is going on, that we look at F0 up to F capital N-1, we select one, we go to the red group, we select one, we go to the blue group, we select one, and so on. This corresponds exactly to pick one out of each column in the way the frames are ordered here. And this property has a name in the literature. It is phrased by saying that the N frames we are dealing with are weaving frames. So that means what we are seeing here is that the Carlson frame can, for each value of n, be split into n subframes, and these n subframes are weaving frames. It's a very particular property for a frame. And it might make you ask, is it the only frame that has this property? And that is the question that I'll discuss in the last part of the lecture. And I have to say already now, at the moment we don't have any other examples, so we have a question that I phrased for you about existence of frames that could have a similar property, but we have not been able to go through with it. What we'll do is actually to go back to the wavelet frames. And wavelet frames, they gave a negative conclusion for us so far. So let's look at the result again. So what the result says is we look at a band limit wavelet frame, and we assume that the support of psi hat is bounded away from 0. And then what I more or less proved for you was that this cannot have the subsampling property, in the sense that if you take capital N to be large, then the system I am displaying in the last line of the slide, namely the wavelet system where the scaling parameter is not a, but it is a to the power capital N, this will no longer be a frame. And this, as I said before, this corresponds exactly to picking one out of n elements of the frame system. So it looked like a negative conclusion. It is a negative conclusion the way it's stated here, but you can see that the condition is that the wavelet system is band limited and that the support is bounded away from zero. What I'll do now is to modify this assumption and take away the assumption that the support is bounded away from zero. What I'll do instead is to assume that psi hat in a small neighborhood about zero is actually lying in an envelope between two polynomials. And this is the condition you see here in the third line, and it is really just a condition that we put on psi hat in an arbitrary small neighborhood about zero. So pick your favorite small neighborhood about zero, put in this condition, which basically says that the psi hat is lying down in an envelope between two polynomial functions. Then what Kim and I were able to show is that then the wavelet system D with parameter A, so D A to the power j, composed with T with parameters K, B, acting on psi. This is a wavelet frame for all values of A bigger than 1 if you choose the parameter B sufficiently small. This is actually great news for us, because what it says is we have a wavelet frame for all choices of A bigger than 1. What it means is that then we also have a frame if we replace A by A to the power capital N for any value of capital N. So that means suddenly we have the frame property for every nth element of our family. This is what I'm stating here. Just look at the first line. I have displayed three lines, three itemized lines, and the first one says that D with the parameter A to the power N also gives us a wavelet frame. And this is simply because this wavelet system has been constructed in such a way that regardless of what dilation parameter we are choosing, we get the frame property. And then what we are doing in this item one, is to have a scaling factor that is not A anymore, but it is A to the power capital N. But this corresponds exactly to picking one out of n elements. So that means this is precisely the result we had for the Carlson frame in the very first slides I was showing. The rest of it is actually more or less trivial, because then we can run the same procedure as I also did for the Carlson frame. We can shift it, and this is what you see in line 2, that we are not anymore just having the scaling operator with parameter A to the power NL, or to the power A to the power capital Nj. We are shifting it by some L, which is 0, 1, 2, up to n minus 1. This is just a matter of acting on a frame with a bounded bijective operator. So this is again giving us a frame. But what it means for us is that the given frame actually can be decomposed into a union of n frames. And this is what I'm saying in the last displayed line. And this was exactly the property we had of the Carlson frame, that for each value of n, it could be split into a union of n frames. So this is what we get for these very particular wavelet frames. And of course, this leads to a question for us, namely, these frames, will they be weaving? The problem is, again, we have not been able to answer this question, but we wanted to answer it, and in our procedure to do that, we introduced the information packages. So again, let's look at the definition I had of the information packages. This is what you saw on the very first slides. It's a collection of closed subspaces of our Hilbert space, such that each element in the space has an unconditional convergent expansion as an infinite linear combination of elements in the spaces W, J. When you look at this, you should now look at it the same way as the frame decomposition. Or you can say you look at it the same way as the frame condition. It's something that gives you a way to decompose all elements in the underlying Hilbert space. When we do it for frames, we decompose in terms of projections down to one-dimensional vectors. What we do here is to project onto these spaces W, J. So conceptually, it's very similar. It's just that we are having elements in higher dimensional spaces than just one-dimensional spaces. What this means is that also the brilliant idea of Pete Casassa of looking at weaving frames, we can move that to the setting of information packages and use exactly the same wording. We can look at a collection of information packages, and then we can define what it should mean that they are weaving. And this is what we did. So we look at these n given information packets, and they are then still these wj, but then they have a upper script L, where L is running from 1 up to n. So we have n of these information packages. And then we say that they are weaving, and this means that if we, for each index j in the index set j, pick one of these spaces and we put all these spaces together, then we are getting an information package. So this is precisely the same definition as the one that was used for weaving of frames. We're just using it for spaces instead of using it for these vectors. There's absolutely no difference. I wish that I had a blackboard in front of me, because it must be difficult to associate to it the way it's stated here in symbols. It's much easier if you can go to the board and then you can write down these spaces as a row or as a column. But if you do that, then you'll see that it's precisely the same thing we are doing here as what I illustrated before with the frames. And based on this concept, we were actually able to prove a result. We were able to show that a collection of spaces form weaving information spaces. The problem is that in the conjecture, or the question I was asking you, the one that was stated here, the question whether your wavelet systems would be weaving, the problem is that we have two parameters, j and k. We have simply too many spaces. We are not able to deal with two parameters at the same time in our calculations. And what we are doing in the theorem that comes out here is that we are actually blocking spaces together, blocking vectors together in spaces. So if you go down already now, before I even state the conditions in the theorem, if you go down now and look at line 8, you can see that we are looking at some spaces Vj. And the space Vj is what we obtain by letting all translation operators act on the given psi, but then we only let the j scaling operator act on it. So that way we are getting a collection of infinite dimensional vector spaces. And you see, this is somehow that I'm blocking all parameters in spaces, because then for each j, you're just letting k run through all these integers. So all of them are blocked in one space. So what is going on in the theorem is that we are putting precisely the conditions that we had before, namely that psi hat is a compactly supported function, and then in a small neighborhood about 0, the psi hat is lying down in an envelope between two polynomial functions. So that was the condition we needed, implying that the wavelet system will actually form a frame for all values of the scaling parameters if we assume that the translation parameter is small enough. And we are not adding any conditions here. This is the condition we are looking at, and then we are looking at the spaces Vj, which I already explained to you. The outcome of the result is that the collection of these spaces, they form information packages. I don't know why I call them information spaces, but they are forming weaving information packets. So we call it a theorem, but you can hear from my presentation that the result is just phrasing what we were able to do. It's not really what we wanted to do, because we wanted to answer the open problem I was phrasing, but as I say, we were not able to deal with both parameters at the same time. It was necessary for technical reason to somehow block spaces together, block vectors together in spaces. And then the information packages came in as the way for us to phrase the conclusion of the theorem that came out here. So that was the way we got the idea of looking at information packages. What I want to do with the first slides I presented in the talk is to convey to you that if you think about the flow of how frame theory has been developed, then it is also a natural concept to deal with. And I'm actually personally very interested in getting to know more about the information packages. And if any of you have any idea of things you would like to discuss concerning that, then I would be very interested to discuss that with you. I think I've used my time. I even think that I've used more than my time. So sorry about that. And thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Will. I'm going to click the button like our people are already doing. That button to thank the speaker for the talk. And now at this point, I'll open the floor to any questions there are. Oh, I have to stop the recording. Oh.